The Butcher's Dozen by Robert Eastland. Read by Peter Barkworth.
The front page headline that morning was a shocker. Number 11, it screamed. The stark black and white photograph beneath it showed leaning gravestones wreathed in ivy. And Miss Mercer fished her spectacles out of her dressing gown pocket in order to read the accompanying story. A police spokesman last night announced that fragments of a human corpse found yesterday in Highgate Cemetery are now believed to belong to yet another victim of the psychopath known as the Mad Butcher of Enfield. If so, this will be the 11th murder attributed to the killer in the past 2 years. "Good heavens," she muttered. "The Mad Butcher of Enfield. Whatever will they come up with next?" She tucked the newspaper under her arm and shuffled through into the kitchen to make herself some tea and toast. As she did so, a loud rapping sounded on the front door. Miss Mercer looked round in surprise and glanced at the kitchen clock. It was only 8:15. The morning post had already been delivered, and the milkman normally came at around 5. Outside, the murderer waited patiently on the front doorstep. A tatty brown briefcase sat beside him, and he stood rigid in the sickly chill of the dawn, his large, knotted hands deep in the pockets of his shabby raincoat. He was a short, solid block of a man, with a pitted, swarthy complexion and thick, horn-rimmed glasses. He wore his hair very short, severely so, and hanging in strings over his heavy bone brow. His eyes were bloodshot, his broad face sallow from lack of sleep. It wasn't too bad a place, he decided, as he looked around him. To one side of the weedy drive, the garden was unkempt with a straggling lawn and derelict garage beyond it. The house itself leaned out over him, the gables above looking ready to slide off altogether, the walls cracked and filled with lichen. It wasn't too bad a place. It would suit his purposes, anyway. He knocked on the front door again. A moment passed, then a latch turned on the other side, and the murderer heard somebody fumbling with a safety chain. Somebody old and arthritic, he decided at once, pleased. Only the stiff and twisted fingers of the old and arthritic fumbled like that. The door opened slightly, and a white-faced old lady looked curiously out. "Yes?" she inquired. "Miss Mercer?" he asked, in a resonant, educated voice. "I believe you have a room to let." Miss Mercer seemed lost for words and eyed him up and down. He gave her a warm, friendly smile. It's a bit early," she finally said. "Fred Saunders," he announced, still beaming. He held out a hand of welcome. "Dr. Frederick Saunders." Oh, doctor." The murderer saw her relax a little. "Oh, well, why didn't you say so?" she said, unfastening the chain. "Come in, do." The murderer stepped inside and wiped his feet on the thick brush mat. He looked around at the sparsely furnished hall, with its solemn paintings and wormy wooden panels. The kitchen was visible through an open door at one end, a bleak, cold place of whitewashed stone by the looks of it. More scullery than a kitchen. Some of these old dears preferred them like that, he considered. It reminded them of a joyous, sunlit childhood, which existed only in their tired, worn-out imaginations. Ornaments of what looked like African origin, carved hunters, spearheads and grass dolls, occupied a low sideboard to his right, while to the left of the kitchen door a steep staircase rose up into darkness. The entire structure reeked of dry rot. Still, the place was clean and serviceable enough. Eventually he looked back at her. Only then, when close up to him, did she notice the odd fish-like gleam in the eyes behind the thick pebble glasses. "I trust this early call is not too great an inconvenience," he said. "Only I detected rain in the air, and I didn't want to wait around too long outside for fear that I might get a soaking." "Oh," was all she could say. Miss Mercer was a little disconcerted at the thought of a man waiting around outside her house in the early morning for any length of time. You've been looking around the neighbourhood, then?" "Not really," he replied. "I've heard about your vacancy from a friend, and I came straight here as soon as my train pulled in. Do forgive me for rousing you at this early hour." "Oh, it's no trouble," she finally said, collecting a key from a vase on the telephone table. She unlocked a door across the hall. It's a downstairs flat, but I think you'll find it quite spacious." The murderer followed her in and found himself in a wide, low-ceilinged room with a narrow bed, a wardrobe, a table, and a chimney breast which had long been bricked up and painted over. A small wash-basin stood in one corner with a portable stove packed away beneath it, its cable wrapped around it and coated in the dust of long disuse. The room looked exceedingly bare, even to the murderer's Spartan eye. The ceiling had grime in the corners, and the bed smelled damp. A radiator ran under the large bay window, but was icy cold. "Charming," he declared. "Absolutely charming. And how much shall I be required to pay?" "Well," said Miss Mercer, now beginning to wonder why a doctor should dress so shabbily and leave his fingernails so encrusted with dirt. "It's £40 a week, pay in advance." "Aha," he grunted, dumping down his case and burrowing into an inside pocket. "Very reasonable, I must say." He produced a wad of £5 notes from a blue leather purse, which looked as though it should belong to a woman, and handed them to her without even bothering to make a count. "I take it I can have access to the bathroom and lavatory?" "Well, yes, but He looked slowly round at her, an eerie gleam in his eyes. "But, Miss Mercer—" She recoiled from him. "But, she continued, stuttering, "I'd prefer it if you didn't run a bath after 10:30 at night, as I tend to go to bed early." "Of course," he said, suddenly amiable again, his massive features splitting into a toothy grin. He began to peel off his greasy overcoat. "Do you require milk or newspapers, Dr. Saunders, anything like that?" she asked, eyeing the worn elbows of his shirt with some distaste, not to mention the frayed cuffs and the black-green stains under his collar. "I prefer to do my own shopping, thank you," he said, no longer looking at her. "Do you require a rent book, then, or anything?" "No, thank you, Miss Mercer," he said loudly, rubbing his big calloused hands together. "Well, very well, then, I'll leave you be," she finally muttered, withdrawing from the room. A few minutes later, Miss Mercer had decided that she didn't like the way that interview had gone. As she made herself a fresh cup of tea, and then, armed with her newspaper, climbed slowly up the stairs to settle down again under the quilt, she went over the events of that morning. Dr. Saunders was a very strange man, she finally concluded. 5 minutes later, she decided that she didn't like him. 10 minutes later, she decided that he wasn't a doctor either, at least not a proper one. Only then did it begin to occur to her that she didn't really know who he was, and that she'd already let him in and make himself at home. Not that she was unduly frightened by that. Miss Mercer had been letting rooms since her father's death in Kenya in 1955, and her sad and lonely return to their ancestral home here in England. So she had plenty of experience of lodgers. She didn't usually even bother with references. The price of the room was often enough to put the more unpleasant kind of homeless people off. And anyway, if there was any trouble, she had a good, strong lock on her bedroom and had a separate telephone up there. She'd never had any call to use either, and she doubted she would on this occasion, though she did feel a little more uncomfortable than usual. Miss Mercer didn't see Dr. Saunders for some time after that. She put in her teeth, then washed, dressed, tied back the curtains in every room, and put out some crumbs for the birds on the back lawn, as was her custom, before tying on her pinny and cheerfully commencing her daily routine. By mid-morning she was busying herself around the hall and porch, feather dusting. Later on, in the afternoon, she put on a shawl, collected her basket, and set off on the weekly trek down to the mini-market. She wondered briefly if it was worth checking with Dr. Saunders to see if he required anything, but there was no sound from his room. He remained hidden from view for all that evening as well, until about 9 o'clock, when Miss Mercer had changed into her nightgown and bedrobe again and was just descending the stairs to find him blocking her passage. He was in his shirt sleeves and had apparently combed and greased back his hair. Aside from that, he'd attended to his person but little, and a stale odour of sweat hung about him. "Good evening, Miss Mercer," he said. "I trust the day has been well with you." She nodded and hung back a little. He may have been short and squat, but he was of huge breadth. His shoulders literally filled the stairwell from wall to banister. "I should be grateful if you'd allow me to use your telephone," he said. Miss Mercer was momentarily lost for words. "Well, I usually charge 10 pence per call," she finally stammered, "for use of the telephone in the hall. If you just put your money in the plate on the table." "Of course," he said. And a second later he'd gone, moving with surprising agility back down the steep stairs and into his room. The door closed quietly behind him, and then she heard the key turning in the lock. It was late that night before Dr. Saunders actually did use the phone. Miss Mercer was just snuggling down between her goose-feather pillows and piping hot water bottles when she heard a distinctive jingle down in the hallway. She climbed painfully from her bed, trying not to creak it too loudly on the old floorboards, then put on her carpet slippers and shuffled out onto the darkened landing. At the bottom of the stairs, clearly visible in the light shining out from his room, Dr. Saunders was in conversation with someone on the telephone. Miss Mercer watched him suspiciously. He was fully dressed. In fact, he had his raincoat on again. That was surely unusual at 11 o'clock at night. Dr. Saunders had a loud bass voice, and even talking quietly as he was attempting to do now, she could still hear him. It was just a matter of adjusting her earpiece. "Don't give me that, you bloody little pipsqueak. Now listen to me. Just you listen to me. The place is crawling with pigs. I'm staying exactly where I am for the time being. Now, you'd better have that money, you bastard, or I'll gut you like a fish when I get back." Oh, yes, really. Well, just have what you owe me, all right? I don't care how you get it, just get it. And with that, he slammed down the phone, then closed and locked the door to his room, and, drawing up his collar around his face, furtively left the house by the front door. No, Miss Mercer decided. Dr. Saunders was definitely not a very nice man. The following morning she was disturbed by another early caller, though this was perhaps a more welcome one. She opened the front door to find Constable Gideon standing there. He was a large, portly officer with a thick chestnut moustache and apple-red cheeks. The sky was clear if cold that morning, so he wore no cape or anorak over his neat black uniform, but was standing on the step with a clipboard under one arm and a pen in his hand. "Ah, Miss Mercer," he said in his usual hearty manner. "Good morning to you, ma'am. I'm sorry it's a wee bit early, but we're going to have to visit all the houses in the district today." "Oh," she said, a little surprised. Is something wrong?" His expression darkened a little. "I'm afraid there is, yes, and it's a very grim business it is too. You know there's been a series of murders in the area recently." She considered hard. "I think I do," she eventually said. "Haven't they been writing about them in the newspapers?" He nodded. "They have indeed, and believe me, they haven't been exaggerating. It's a very nasty affair, very nasty indeed." She shivered, and he immediately put a consoling arm about her shoulders. "Not to worry, though, ma'am. I'm sure we'll catch him. Now, the thing is, you see, we're doing what's called a house-to-house. All that means is that I've got to ask you a lot of quick questions, all right?" "Well, yes, if you think it'll help, Constable." "Oh, I'm sure it will," he said, grinning, and lifting up his clipboard and pen. "Now, have you seen anyone in the area at all you didn't like the look of, who's a stranger, perhaps, or is someone who's been behaving rather peculiarly?" She shook her face dumbly. Right, that's okay. Now, has any of your neighbours changed their routine, perhaps? Does anyone go out at night instead of at day? Has anyone new moved into the area?" And so it went on for another 10 minutes. When Constable Gideon had left, deeply regretting that he didn't have time for a cuppa, Miss Mercer withdrew into her house to think. Glancing sideways, she saw the door to Dr. Saunders' room ajar by a tiny fraction, and the cold, glazed eye of the gentleman himself looking out at her in a most piercing manner. A moment later, the door clicked shut, and the key turned in the lock. She was beginning to get her suspicions about Dr. Saunders, very firm suspicions indeed, she decided. Perhaps it was time to do something. And off she went to prepare. An hour later, she reappeared beside his door, swathed in her shawl, and knocked loudly. Initially, there was no reply, so she knocked again. Eventually he appeared, still clad in his usual crumpled clothes, only now looking sleepy and unshaven. She backed away from him a little, but now feeling organised and reminding herself that she was the mistress of this house, stayed resolute. "Dr. Saunders, I really must complain about this behaviour." He feigned innocence, though his feigning was clearly only skin-deep. "My dear Miss Mercer, what behaviour?" "You are a naughty man, you know, to keep me awake at night the way you did." His red-rimmed eyes seemed to narrow. "I kept you awake last night?" "Why, yes, on the telephone, really. 11 o'clock is not the time to be making phone calls, and I object most strongly to the language you used. What must your friend think of you speaking to him like that? Was that the friend who directed you to this house? I sincerely hope not, for all the people I know would be deeply offended to be spoken to like that." He leaned against the doorframe and folded his large arms. "I feel there's something I should tell you, Miss Mercer. No friend directed me to this house. I got your name and address from the local parish magazine, which I picked up for 5 pence from a newsagent." He smiled, but now there was no warmth in it. "Yes, Miss Mercer, nobody knows I'm here at all." Nervously, she took a step away from him towards the kitchen. "Perhaps you'd care for a spot of tea?" "There's no time for tea now, Miss Mercer," he said, slowly straightening up again. "You really shouldn't eavesdrop on private conversations. You really shouldn't, you know." Miss Mercer turned quickly, and as fast as she was able, made her way along the hall and veered right into the kitchen. The murderer followed at a leisurely pace, stopping only to rip out the telephone cable. In the kitchen, he could hear her fumbling with the latch on the back door. Ah, those old arthritic fingers, he thought. What a nuisance they could be. When he entered the kitchen, she was just in the act of passing out through the back door, and he watched her through the window over the sink as she tottered across the lawn towards the garage, her wrinkled face chalk white and straining with the effort. The murderer grinned, then selected a razor-sharp fruit knife from the drawer before following her. When he went outside, however, he was surprised to see her disappearing into the garage rather than rounding the corner of the house in the direction of the front drive. That brought an element of uncertainty into the affair, and elements of uncertainty he didn't need. He strode quickly towards the garage. The knife was concealed up his sleeve in case any neighbour was watching through the tall trees surrounding the property. Inside the garage, it was dark, damp, and reeked of brick mould. But the murderer was surprised to find a Mini Cooper parked there. It had a very old registration mark, but was in good condition and quite clean, with firm runnels gouged into the soft earth floor behind its tyres. So it had obviously been driven recently. It was now standing in the shadows, the pale light from outside gleaming in its chrome bumper bar. Momentarily, the murderer was flummoxed. This didn't mean she had another lodger, did it? "The car is mine, Dr. Saunders," she suddenly announced, stepping out from the darkness at the far end of the chamber. "And the police will know it and instantly recognise it. So don't think you can steal it." "I wouldn't dream of stealing it, dear lady," he replied, ambling stealthily along the left-hand side of the car towards her. "To begin with, I've no driving licence." Fearlessly, Miss Mercer remained where she was, her slight pointed chin held proudly out, her seamed face in a stern frown of disapproval. "I don't think I want you in my house much longer," she said. "I've some rather unpleasant suspicions about you, Dr. Saunders." "'Tis a terrible thing, is suspicion," he said, coming closer, the fruit knife hidden behind his back. He had now reached the front offside of the parked car and moved around it, stepping over some crates, fixing her with his spear-like gaze. Trembling, she stood her ground as best she could. She was a game old bird, he reflected. Either that or she was possibly too senile to realize the peril she was in. Normally, they at least showed some fear by now, some dull-witted animal understanding that their worthless life was at an end. He would show her the knife, he decided. That always brought a reaction, when you showed them the implement of their destruction. Then she shot him. It was very dark in the dilapidated garage, and the murderer's sight had never been that good at the best of times, so he could not possibly have seen the old Webley revolver buried in the folds of her shawl. He fell stiffly, gaping, and hit the hard ground a lifeless husk, the knife still tightly clasped in his gnarled fist. Miss Mercer came tentatively forward to check that he was dead. He was, and she was hardly surprised. Her father's old gun had never once misfired, and from this close range even she couldn't possibly have missed. For a moment she stood thinking in the darkness. Now, what to do? He'd already told her that nobody knew he was there. Well, that was a good start, she supposed. It was just a pity that he wasn't lying closer to the back of the car. This was not going to be easy, she thought resignedly, as she shuffled around to the boot, then unlocked it and took out the hacksaw and cleaver. It was always easy to make a body more disposable. She'd watched the Mau Mau terrorists do that with countless of their hostages during her long, long captivity in Kenya. Her poor father only one of them. But this time she would have to be far more careful where she sprinkled the pieces. She'd been surprised, rather than alarmed, at the speed with which the police had connected her 11 other victims. But there was no point in taking unnecessary chances. The Mau Mau had been very careless, and look what happened to them.